October 1942, Dayton, Ohio. America's accountants did the math, and the Thompson was bleeding the war dry. $200 a gun, polished wood and machined steel, gorgeous and impossible to build by the million. Enter George Hyde at General Motors with an order that sounded insane. Make a .45 that hits like a Thompson, costs a tenth as much, and is ready in 7 months. No walnut, no hand fitting, just stamped steel, spot welds, and cold practicality. Soldiers would call it the grease gun, laugh at it, then trust it with their lives. Stay to the end and subscribe, because this is how ugly beat beautiful and won a war. The fall of 1942 found the United States at a breaking point between idealism and survival. The Thompson submachine gun, beautiful, powerful, and iconic, had become a financial disaster. Each unit cost roughly $200 to produce, an astronomical sum when multiplied by the millions of men preparing for deployment across 2 hemispheres. At that price, the weapon that symbolized American firepower risked pricing itself out of the very war it was built for. The Pentagon knew it, General Motors knew it, and a German-born engineer named George Hyde knew it better than anyone. If America couldn't arm its soldiers cheaply, victory itself was at risk. The Army's directive to Hyde was brutally simple: design a submachine gun that could do everything the Thompson could, but at 1/10 the cost. No ornate wood stocks, no expensive machining, and no reliance on skilled gunsmiths. The new weapon had to be stamped, welded, and pressed into existence using automotive methods. It had to be so easy to make that Detroit's factories could turn out tens of thousands a month. Hyde's challenge represented more than a cost problem. It was a philosophical one. America's military had long equated craftsmanship with quality, seeing polished finishes and precision machining as proof of superiority. Now, the war demanded something different, function stripped to its bones. If it worked, it lived. If it failed, men died. Colonel René Studler, the Army's ordnance chief, made it clear. There would be no extensions, no excuses. The invasion of Italy was coming, and the soldiers storming those beaches needed reliable close-quarters firepower. Hyde had 7 months to deliver the impossible. The future of American small arms, and possibly thousands of lives, would hinge on whether he could turn factory steel into a battlefield solution before the clock ran out. George Hyde's office at General Motors' Inland Division in Dayton didn't look like the birthplace of a military revolution. It smelled of oil, drafting paper, and cigarette smoke, the same as any other wartime engineering bay. But behind that cluttered desk sat a man under impossible pressure. Born in Germany, Hyde had spent decades designing sporting rifles and experimental pistols before immigrating to America. Now, at 52, his job wasn't elegance, it was speed. The Army had told him in plain English, 7 months, or soldiers would go to war without submachine gun. Hyde knew what that meant. Every delay, every wasted day at the drawing board might cost lives in Sicily or the Pacific. He understood that the only way to meet such a deadline was to abandon tradition entirely. The old world of gunsmithing, machined steel blocks, walnut stocks, fine polishing, was gone. In its place stood America's car industry, humming with presses, welders, and stamping dies that could shape metal by the ton. Hyde studied GM's recent project, the Liberator, a single-shot pistol built for European resistance fighters. It had been crude, made from sheet metal, yet produced by the million at breakneck speed. If a pistol could be pressed like a car fender, could a submachine gun be born the same way? He gathered a small team of automotive engineers, men who had never built weapons but understood efficiency better than any gunsmith alive. Their advantage wasn't experience, it was perspective. They didn't care how a gun was supposed to look. They cared how fast it could be built. Hyde began sketching designs that violated every unwritten rule of military craftsmanship. Instead of elegant receivers, he drew stamped clamshells that could be welded together in minutes. Instead of hardwood grips, he planned on wire frames and pressed steel handles. Function, not form. Each night, he stayed after hours, poring over blueprints under the glow of fluorescent lamps. When the janitors came through, they found him muttering to himself about tolerances, spring tension, and tooling curves. He knew the Army would hate it. It would look like an oil can with a trigger, but he didn't care. The war wasn't waiting for pretty guns. By late October, The first mock-ups began to take shape. Welders repurposed car body jigs to form prototype receivers, and machinists scavenged leftover steel from headlight assemblies to fashion crude bolts. What emerged on Hyde's bench looked more like a garage experiment than a weapon of war. But in that raw frame lay the seed of something extraordinary, a machine gun that could be built faster, cheaper, and tougher than anything America had fielded before. Hyde didn't yet know it, but he was about to turn industrial pragmatism into military doctrine. The weapon he was designing would soon earn a nickname that perfectly captured its simplicity: the grease gun. The first prototype rolled off the workbench like an insult to tradition. It was little more than stamped steel bent into shape, welded seams, a crude wire stock, and a bolt that clunked forward with mechanical indifference. Hyde called it the T-15, though the men in the shop nicknamed it the oil can. Still, it worked. It fired 45 ACP rounds with consistent accuracy. It was easy to strip and clean, and its projected cost came in at under $25, a tenth of the Thompson. To Hyde, that number was everything, but to the Army's ordnance evaluators, it was almost an affront. When he arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for the official demonstration, Hyde knew what was coming before the first officer even picked it up. The gun felt light, too light. Its receiver wasn't polished. Its frame wasn't beautiful. One officer sneered, "It looks like something you'd find in a Buick trunk, not an armory." Hyde stood silently as they fired the prototype downrange. It performed exactly as expected: steady, reliable, controllable. But when the officers gathered afterward, the verdict had nothing to do with performance. "This isn't a soldier's weapon," Major Harrison said flatly. "It's a piece of plumbing." To them, aesthetics equaled confidence. A gun that looked cheap would make soldiers feel cheap. The Army wanted something affordable, but not something that looked like it. Hyde left Aberdeen that evening with his design rejected, his pride bruised, and the war no closer to a solution. But on the train ride back to Dayton, something changed in him. He realized he'd been trying to appease an institution, trapped in nostalgia. The war wasn't going to be won by craftsmen. It was going to be won by production lines. The Germans had learned that lesson with their stamped MP-40s. The Soviets with their PPSH-41s. America's advantage was industry, not aesthetics, so Hyde decided to double down. If the Army didn't like how his weapon looked, he'd make it so useful they couldn't afford to ignore it. Back at GM, he called in Frederick Sampson, a production engineer who knew car assembly like breathing. Together, they tore the T-15 apart piece by piece. What could be simplified, they simplified. What could be stamped, they stamped. The new design, labeled the T-20, eliminated nearly every machined component. Its receiver was two pressed steel halves, welded together like a car panel. Its stock collapsed into the body for easy storage. Its bolt ran slower than the Thompson's, conserving ammunition while staying on target during sustained fire. Every decision screamed practicality. When Hyde held the finished T-20, he knew it was ugly, but he also knew beauty didn't stop bullets. This gun could be built by the thousand, by workers who'd never seen a rifle before. It could fall into mud and still fire. It could cost 1/10 as much as the Thompson and outperform it in every test that mattered. The Army didn't know it yet, but the future of American warfare had just been born. Not in a gun factory, but in an automotive plant. Hyde and Sampson stripped the M3 to essentials: reliability, manufacturability, and control. The breakthrough was brutal simplicity. Instead of a machined receiver carved from solid steel, the M3 used two pressed steel halves welded together. Those halves could be stamped on automotive presses in seconds and spot welded with car body tools. The receiver cost almost nothing to produce yet was robust in service. The bolt was heavy and slow by design. Where the Thompson cycled at high rates and burned ammunition, the M3's lower cyclic speed improved controllability and conserved rounds during sustained fire. Its action was fully enclosed, no exposed parts to suck in mud, sand, or grime. That choice turned a weapon that jammed in the field into one that kept firing with minimal maintenance. Hyde replaced expensive walnut stocks with a telescoping wire frame that collapsed for cramped spaces and extended for stability. The safety became a dust cover flip, open to fire, closed to safe. Simple, intuitive, and hard to foul. Magazines were stamped, not hand-filed. Feeding lips formed in dies. Sights were basic stamped posts. Each component favored function over finish. Manufacturing advantages were enormous. A guide lamp headlight line retooled to press receivers could produce hundreds an hour. Thompson manufacture demanded dozens of skilled machining steps. The M3 needed only 3 machined parts and scores of stamped components. Material use fell. Weight dropped. Production sped up. Wartime resources stretched further. The M3 traded glamour for consistency. It looked crude because it was built to be inexpensive and reliable. Those traits were strategic. Speed of production, ease of maintenance, and battlefield dependability were the gun's true virtues. Soldiers did not need beauty. They needed a weapon that worked when everything else failed. In muddy trenches and frozen roads, that choice saved lives. Now, they called it ugly. The soldiers would call it a grease gun. But every ugly choice in its design was a deliberate answer to a battlefield problem. The heart of the M3 was its stamped receiver, 2 pressed steel halves welded like car fenders. Where a Thompson required hours of precision machining, the M3's receiver could be formed in seconds on an autopress and spot welded on the same lines that made bumpers and hoods. That lower-cost method wasn't sloppy, it was predictable. Dies cut identical parts every cycle. Welds that looked crude were uniform and strong. The result was a receiver that was cheap to make, light to carry, and repeatable in performance across factories. Hyde's bolt was heavy by intent. It cycled at roughly 450 rounds per minute, significantly slower than a Thompson, which meant 2 things: controllability and ammunition economy. In close quarters, a slow, heavy bolt kept bursts manageable. Men could place fire where they needed it instead of emptying drums in chaos. The enclosed action was another battlefield choice. Dust, mud, sand, and freezing air couldn't reach the internals the way they could on an exposed Thompson. The M3 kept firing when others choked. Ergonomics favored function. The wire telescoping stock packed compact for tanks and gliders, but extended for shoulder fire. The dust cover safety doubled as a foolproof fire selector. Flip it open to fire, closed to safe. Magazines were stamped, not hand-filed. Sights were simple stamped posts. None of it was pretty, but it worked after weeks in jungle rot or the hard freeze of Ardennes mornings. Manufacturing changed overnight. Headlight factories retooled to press receivers. Workers trained in stamping became wartime gun builders in weeks. Production scaled from dozens of Thompsons a day to thousands of M3s. Raw material use dropped. Tooling changeovers shrank. Quality, once solved, became consistent. The M3's anatomy wasn't an accident of thrift. It was a philosophy, designed for what the soldier faces, not for what looks right on parade. In mud, snow, and steel-tight tank turrets, those choices would decide who lived. When the first M3 shipments hit training camps, reaction ranged from bemused to hostile. At Fort Benning, instructors held the stamped steel guns like curios. No polished walnut, no sculpted blued steel, just a clipped wire stock and a dust cover safety that looked embarrassingly simple. "Feels cheap," wrote one NCO. Officers worried about morale. Weapons were more than tools, they said. They were symbols. A soldier's pride, they argued, could be as crucial as his kit. The M3's nickname, Grease Gun, was first a taunt, then a test. But doctrine doesn't win battles. Performance does. Hyde and his proponents let the numbers and reports answer the prejudice. Training units found that recruits learned the M3 faster. Its simple controls reduced fumbling under stress. Ammunition use dropped because the slow cyclic rate encouraged controlled bursts. Worst of all for critics. In close quarters drills, the M3 turned more trainees into effective shooters faster than the Thompson. Psychological resistance persisted, but it began to erode, not by rhetoric, but by results. Aberdeen's torture bench proved decisive. In standardized mud tests, the Thompson choked after dozens of rounds. The M3's enclosed action kept firing as grit flew. In sand trials mirroring North Africa, the Thompson required frequent stripping. The M3 kept cycling. Cold weather runs that simulated Ardennes nights revealed the glaring difference. Exposed Thompson springs stiffened and jammed, where the M3's heavy bolt maintained momentum. Field reports matched lab data. Marines in New Guinea praised a gun that survived river crossings without cleaning. Tank crews cheered a weapon that fit inside a turret. Statistics killed prejudice. Sustained fire stoppages dropped dramatically. Mean rounds to failure favored the M3 across environments. When tests showed the stamped magazine and welded seams held up under repeated abuse, the Army's argument narrowed to looks. But looks don't keep men alive. Reliability does. By mid-1944, units in Europe and the Pacific stopped mocking the grease gun and started depending on it. The ugly weapon had passed its trial by dirt, and the military's old biases began to yield to a harsher, truer litmus: who came home. By 1943, America's assembly lines had become its arsenal, and the M3 was the perfect machine for that new reality. At General Motors' Guide Lamp Division in Anderson, Indiana, the same factory that once turned out millions of headlights, the transformation was astonishing. Overnight, the smell of paint and chrome gave way to hot steel and welding sparks. The lines that had once shaped car parts were now stamping the bodies of submachine guns. The conversion took just half an hour. The same presses, the same workers, but a new mission: arm a nation. Unlike traditional gun plants, these workers weren't gunsmiths. They were machinists, welders, and tool fitters from Detroit and Cleveland, men and women who had spent the Great Depression fixing fenders, not forging firepower. Yet within weeks, they were turning out over 1,000 M3s a day. Each part fit another like car components. No hand filing, no custom fitting, no time wasted. A Thompson demanded 109 machining operations and the hands of a craftsman. An M3 needed fewer than 15, and the mind of an engineer. This was Henry Ford's vision turned into warfare: interchangeability, mass production, speed. A worker trained in the morning could assemble a gun by afternoon. A factory line could switch from headlights to weapons and back again without shutting down. It was mechanical democracy. Every unit nearly identical, every gun a piece of a much larger organism called American industry. But mass production had its dangers. Quality drifted as new plants joined in. Weak recoil springs appeared. Bolts cracked. Welds failed when rushed. Critics of Hyde's stamped design pounced, calling the problems proof that America had traded craftsmanship for chaos. Hyde fought back the only way he knew how, with math, testing, and redesign. Every defect was a data point. Every failure refined the next batch. The improved M3A1 was born from that crucible. Simpler, stronger, and even easier to build. The American factory had done what generals alone could not. It turned the tide through sheer volume, efficiency, and faith in the idea that perfect enough, built fast enough, wins wars. By mid-1944, the M3 was in soldiers' hands, and the battlefield became its proving ground. The laughter that had followed it through training camps vanished the moment the shooting started. In Italy's stone villages, tank crews discovered that the M3's short frame fit perfectly inside turrets, where Thompsons snagged on armor plating. One sergeant wrote, "You can swing this thing like a wrench in a tank fight." Its wire stock slid open in seconds, and its slow, steady rate of fire kept bursts tight. For crews in Shermans and Stuarts, it became a lifeline when German infantry got too close for the main gun. In the Pacific, the jungle tested every weapon's soul. Mud, heat, and rain devoured metal. And the Thompson's open action was a magnet for failure. Marines in Bougainville and New Guinea quickly learned to swap for M3s when they could. Corporal Anthony Ritchie scrawled in his field journal, "Dropped it in a river, picked it up, still shot straight." The fancy ones rusted solid. The M3's sealed receiver and blowback simplicity shrugged off the tropics' punishment. Where humidity corroded everything else, the grease gun kept firing day after day. Then came Europe's winter. December 1944, the Ardennes. Temperatures dropped below zero. Gun oil froze. Steel cracked. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted, Thompson bolts froze mid-pull. Their lubricants turned to glue. The M3, heavier and slower, worked flawlessly. "It was ugly," wrote one private, "but it talked back when the rest of them went silent." By 1945, skepticism had turned to reverence. Soldiers had stopped calling it a joke. They called it a friend. Its clumsy looks no longer mattered. It had earned its place through survival. The grease gun wasn't glamorous. It didn't gleam in newsreels, but in tanks, foxholes, jungles, and frozen forests. It proved that reliability, not beauty, wins wars. Each dented receiver told the same story. The ugliest gun in America had become the one soldiers trusted most. When the war ended, the Thompson was remembered with nostalgia, but it was the M3 that endured. George Hyde's stamped, welded, no-frills invention had done more than fill a battlefield role. It had rewritten how America thought about weapons. After World War II, the M3 served again in Korea, where sub-zero temperatures crippled most firearms. Soldiers reported firing hundreds of rounds without malfunction. One infantryman wrote, "That grease gun sounded like salvation in the snow." In the brutal winters of the Chosin Reservoir, the gun's simplicity became its armor. The M3 outlived its critics. Through Korea, Vietnam, and even into the 1990s in National Guard inventories, it proved that low-cost design didn't mean low performance. Its guiding principle, function over form, became gospel for engineers designing everything from rifles to tanks to aircraft. The Army's procurement philosophy shifted. No longer would appearance or tradition outweigh maintainability, interchangeability, and efficiency. Hyde's quiet revolution inside a Dayton drafting room had become a permanent part of U.S. doctrine. Even the soldiers who once mocked it came to respect it. The grease gun wasn't something you posed with. It was something you survived with. It fired when frozen, buried, or drenched. It required no affection, only ammunition. Mechanics loved it because they understood it. Tankers swore by it because it fit their world of cramped steel. Paratroopers carried it because it folded down like a tool. In the end, its ugliness was its beauty. It represented the blunt truth of industrial war. Survival depends on what works. George Hyde died in 1963, long before the M3 finally retired. But his design outlived both the man and the myths surrounding it. He had built not a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but a masterpiece of logic. And in doing so, he gave America something greater than a gun. He gave it a philosophy. In every modern weapon that favors reliability over refinement, Hyde's fingerprints remain. The grease gun proved that in war, perfection isn't polished, it's practical.